and welcome to the Haddonfield United Methodist Church Weekly Sermon Podcast. For more information about us or anything you hear in this episode, be sure to visit haddonfieldumc.org. We hope that this and every episode can help sustain you on the journey as together we seek to put our faith into action.
Hi friends, welcome to our sermon podcast. My name is Pastor Chris Heckert, Senior Pastor here, and this is Mother's Day weekend. We are also in the middle of our sermon series, Winds of Change.
The question of identity is a lifelong journey as we constantly face the winds of change, whether we're ready or not. While change is both essential and inevitable, it leads to growth on the other side. How can we live through this season in the fullness of God? Join us for our sermon series, The Winds of Change, as we explore how to find peace with ourselves and each other through the stories of people in the Bible who faced life's challenges in different seasons.
Our text is Exodus 2, verses 1 through 10. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses because he said, "I drew him out of the water." Well, this is Mother's Day weekend, and it has me reflecting on my own mom, and you may be reflecting on a parent or a mothering figure or someone else in your life who's nurtured you or blessed you, or maybe your own experience in life. I also am reflecting on my own birth, having a birthday that usually falls on or around Mother's Day. And what do you know about your own birth story? I've grown up hearing different versions of when I was born. And the one story I hear the most consistently has to do with my birth date and most specifically my time of birth. I was born on Thursday, May 12th, 1977, somewhere within an hour of midnight. Now, it might not seem significant unless you think about the day of the week and the date of the birth, Thursday the 12th, close to midnight, which would very quickly become Friday the 13th. My grandmother, my mom's mom, was a little bit superstitious, to be polite. Never would seat 13 people at a holiday table or any table, and would not go down a road if a black cat had walked across the street. And she surely was not going to permit any child to enter her home if he or she were born on, Friday the 13th. So my mother, apparently, in all the versions of the story that I've heard it, was begging me as she was in labor for an extended period of time to be born before it was too late and her mother would not want me to enter her home. Well, by the grace of God and all other things, I was born before Friday and born on Thursday. You know, we love to think about the stories of our own origin and the stories of origin of people that we love. And another thing I like to think about in terms of birthday is I have an Apple Watch, and one of the faces that I use is the rotation of the planets. And if you turn the crown of the watch, you can go back a few days and the planets will rotate. And one night I was putting my kids to sleep and they were playing with the crown, and they were going back. And we realized that if you go back far enough, you can find their birthdays and see what the planets looked like and how they were aligned on the day that the kids were born. And so it was a lot of fun, except if you accidentally pushed the button, it would reset and you'd have to go backward. Not all that big of a deal for a kid born in 2012 and 2014. But then when we decided we wanted to see what the planets looked like on my birthday, we had to try it like 15 times, because as you keep winding to try and get back to 1977, it kept resetting and we had to go back and forth and back and forth. The reality is as we look at what the alignment of the planets are on the day of our birth, and I know this is now a very popular Mother's Day gift, is you can buy a necklace or a poster or something that shows the phase of the moon on your birthday for your mother, or the alignment of the planets. The reality is it reminds us that while very few of us enjoy change, change is always in motion. We're reminded the moment we are born, the very next day, the picture changes. And the very next day, the picture changes. And just like winding the crown of a watch, things go around. And while I was born on a Thursday, quickly, time moved on. In this sermon series, we are looking at that magic word, change. The winds of change. What happens when change blows in our life? Well, it always is blowing. It's always happening, because the reality is while we like things to stay the same, we are on a rock that is constantly spinning around a burning ball of fire. Can you imagine that? And there are other rocks that are also spinning in other directions and around us. And so those alignments are always shifting and always changing. Of course, we live in a planet that knows 4 distinct seasons, but the lines are ebbing and flowing in the spectrum between spring and summer and fall and winter and spring are constantly changing and shifting. How do we manage change? Maybe you like it. Maybe you like exciting things, new things. Maybe it's hard. Maybe it's challenging for you. Well, in our story in today's podcast, Exodus chapter 2, I want to look at this thing. Sometimes the best option is the worst bad choice. Well, recently I was watching a podcast or an interview with guitarist and country singer Vince Gill. He is an incredible musician and he has a phenomenal guitar collection. And the person who was interviewing him was in his music studio, in which he has hundreds of amazing vintage guitars. And the guy interviewing him said, Vince, if this place were on fire and you could pick the top 4 instruments to save, what would they be? And of course, he picked different ones, Telecaster, a Martin, a Gibson acoustic, and a Les Paul. Great choices, if you know what he's talking about. But the reality is when a fire strikes, or when a disaster strikes, or when change strikes, we usually don't get the best choices. You don't get to say which are the best you would do. It's usually the least bad choice that you have. In the 2nd chapter of Exodus, we see the mother of Moses. Moses would become the hero and the leader of the Israelite people by the end of the story. But at the beginning of the story, in Exodus chapter 1, the descendants of Joseph, the descendants of Abraham, are in Egypt because they came to Egypt in a time of famine, and they stayed there for generations, and they thrived. And Joseph died, and his children died. And over time, the pharaohs, the Egyptians, forgot who the Jewish people were, other than that they were foreigners, and they had different practices, and they began to overrun the place. And so the pharaoh saw all these outsiders draining the resources of the nation. And so he said, why don't you, when you see babies with their mothers, why don't you dash their heads against a rock or in the stream? And he told midwives to murder boys that they were responsible for taking care of. They didn't want to do it. And nobody wanted to participate in this murderous behavior. So the Pharaoh ordered this edict that boys would be murdered by Egyptians to control the population of the Israelites living in Egypt. And so here you see in the beginning of chapter 2, Moses' mother does not have a good choice. She really has 3 choices. 1, do nothing, and her baby boy, brand new, newborn, will likely be murdered. The second choice is to give the child away. And the same thing will happen. Well, the third choice is not a good choice. The third choice is that she takes the child and she puts him in a basket and puts him in a very dangerous body of water. I've been on the Nile River. It's filled with crocodiles and hippos and snakes and birds. Nobody would ever choose to abandon their child in a river. But the mother does the best bad thing. And what she does is she is faithful to make sure that the son has the best option, even though it's the worst thing for her, which means she will be separated from him. And so what she does is she coats the basket in pitch to make sure that it doesn't sink and to make sure that perhaps it's waterproof and protected from animals. And she puts it in the reeds near where other women Egyptians will see the child. And so when she faces change, like many of us in our lives, she's not faced with the greatest, what's the best future for your son. The least awful decision is to save him from being murdered by abandoning him in water. Now, she doesn't completely abandon him. She sends her older daughter, to watch after the brother who camps out and watches and sees him in the reeds. And then, of course, Pharaoh's daughter, where they probably intentionally put the basket, is bathing and sees the basket and rescues the baby. And then Moses' sister comes up and says, hey, do you want me to get someone to nurse the child? Right? And so the mother is ready, and the mother does get to be involved in the child's life and nurse Moses. But it says that when he was growing up, she then entrusted him back to the daughter of Pharaoh, which means that she did not get to raise him. And it's a beautiful story. It's an awful story. It's a story that becomes one of redemption, but right now it's one of horror and tragedy and loss. And what we see in this story is just like those rotating planets. What it looks like now, it's about to shift, and it won't end up looking anything like what it looks like now. But you have to hang on a little bit. As I look at this story, what I realized is that when we are faithful in times of distress, God can transform disaster into deliverance. When we are faithful in times of distress, God can transform disaster into deliverance. The mother is faithful to the child, not to her own needs or wants, but to the child's life. The sister is faithful to the child. And even Pharaoh's daughter, who knew probably that a Hebrew child shouldn't survive, she also was faithful to the call of a baby. And all 3 of these women, these mothering spirits, these mothers in their own right, they were faithful in distress. And God takes this disaster, natural disaster, human-made disaster, and begins to build an ark that leads to deliverance. I remember many years ago, I attended a chapel service in New York City, and the dean of the New York Theological School gave a sermon called From Chronos to Kairos. And he talked about being a banker during 9/11. And in 2001, he was in the financial institutions and Wall Street, and he was downtown when the planes hit the towers. And in the days and the years to follow, his life fell apart, like many people. He questioned his purpose in life, and he realized in caring for human needs, and realized when his life was reprioritized, like so many people during that time, he realized that God was calling him to change his career and to go into ministry. So not only did he go to seminary and go into ministry, but ultimately he would become the dean of a theological school. And so he said that God took chronological time, in which he thought he was, showing up, doing work. He was on a trajectory to retire at a certain age. The whole thing got interrupted, and he realized that what can prevail over chronological time is Kairos time, which is God's timing. And sometimes when we're faithful to what we feel God is doing and wants to do in our lives, God can transform those chronological moments that don't add up and can turn it into God's own meaning, into Kairos, God's timing. Well, we really see the same thing in this story, where God takes this Hebrew or Israelite boy, raises him in a non-Hebrew home, in the home of Pharaoh, and then later reunites him with his own people and turns him into the deliverer. But we would never know that at the beginning in a story that starts in tragedy and that starts in a time of distress. I often remember this phrase, and will share it with people who are facing difficult times. Remember that if this is the end of the story, it's probably a pretty bad story. But perhaps this is just where the story gets interesting. Think about it. Think of your favorite movie. Think of your favorite book. Think of your favorite musical. Usually they have an arc. We establish the characters and the plot and the set and the theme. And then they hit some sort of a tragedy or a twist, right? A challenge. Well, if the book ends right there, it's a pretty awful book. Pretty bad movie. But usually that's where it gets interesting. And then there's a twist and resolve happens at the end. As we face change and challenge in our own lives, we must remember that change is constant. When we are faithful in distress, God can transform disaster into deliverance. Reflecting on the changing planets and the story of my own birth and my mother's own journey, it was when I was in high school that my mom shared a story with me about leaving college because she and my dad found out they were having my sister. And my mom was the first woman in her family to go to college. She went to Millersville in Lancaster County. And but they had been married a year or so, and my mom found out she was pregnant with my sister. And so she left college to be a mom. And so when I was in high school, my mom kind of sat us down and let us know that she felt that it was time for her to go back to school in her late 40s and early 50s. She found a program that allowed her to go on nights and weekends. And around the same year that I was to graduate college, my mom also graduated college in her early or mid 50s. Beautiful story of her perseverance. And I know I've shared that before. But these last couple years, as I also have gone back to grad school, around the same period of life, I have thought time and time again of my mom's courage. And not only her perseverance to work and raise kids and do school, but I thought about all those years in between in which it seemed that the dream had ended, the ability of her to finish college degree, to raise her family, and when she actually did the work. How many of us live and find ourselves in that season where it seems like the dream dies and we don't yet know if the new thing is possible? Well, each day that these planets shift around us, and whatever change or challenge you find yourself in, remember this. If the story ended here, I might not recommend the book to someone else. The good news is that God is always doing a new thing. God is always at work in our lives. And like Moses' mother, Moses' sister, and Pharaoh's daughter, when we focus on doing the right thing for the right reason, God can shift disaster into a story of deliverance, delivering us from challenges and heartache and pain into grace and love and freedom and reconciliation. Friend, whatever change you are facing today, be faithful to things big and small. And as we've shared here before, if we handle the little things like they're big things, God will handle the big things like they are little things, and will get us through not just to the next step, but for the next mile. May you be blessed to be a blessing. Amen.
Thanks again for listening. For more information about us or anything you heard in this episode, be sure to visit haddonfieldumc.org. Through today's scripture and message, we pray that you find strength to go deeper into love of God and neighbor as we work together to be the church in a hurting world.